Hey guys, this is Mikro back with another video. This one is gonna be what I think the meta will transform to on the PTR based off what is currently being played in OPR, the one PTR war, and just with logically how the perks will go. I imagine this build or this video will either be completely wrong because something changes in one of the assumptions I'm gonna state that I make, or that I maybe just forgot a variable completely, but the TLDR of all this is based off of what I am seeing. I think that I think that Dex builds inherently will be more valuable than melee Dex builds will inherently be more valuable than Great Sword Warhammer, and then that in turn will basically have a lot of consequences on what the meta is. To start off, the biggest thing that changed with the PTR, where there are a couple big things. Uh, One, this 300 con perk being grit now and not having the CC duration bonuses basically makes it so that freedom is less useful. Two, medium and heavy have inherent passive freedom, so freedom isn't as desired of. And because this 300 con perk is more commonplace, a lot of those changes to those weapons are now more util roll rather than damage roll. There will be less of a need to run freedom as a whole, but it will still be played. What I mean by that is before the magic number was you get to 4 freedom. So if you're in heavy now, instead of running 4 freedom, you just need 2 freedom. If you're in medium, instead of running 3 freedom, instead of running 4 freedom, you need freedom. If you're in light, you either need 4 freedom or you just kind of ignore that matchup entirely and you run stone form or have some other way to work around that. So in terms of what has been happening in terms of like meta, uh Great Axe Warhammer is not playable, but it is very close to being non-playable in a traditional format where you run at people just due to the presence of just inherent damage on the PTR in general. Most of that is coming from firestaff. There's also some of that coming from Dex, but it's like 80 to 90% firestaff. That as a whole won't have a ton of consequence because people will just switch their ward setup from being to slash to firestaff because Great Axe Warhammer doesn't do that much damage anymore, and firestaff tends to do a lot more damage. But as consequence of Great Axe Warhammer not being as good at chasing down the firestaff and firestaff being the inherent thing that does damage, there will be like shifts to the meta. For example, the firestaff inherently, when you look at the PTR one, a lot of its damage is based off of dots, and that dot damage will increment over time. And if you don't get rid of those dots, then they will essentially turn into burst damage, which has the potential to be set up for some sort of very quick kill combo, which I imagine will roll around. I've seen some people do it with Ice Spike and are able to basically two-shot people like almost immediately if they do like an fireball into heavy into fireball into ice spike that can basically just one-shot someone because of it will detonate all the stacks of burn that they have. You hit them with the fireball on top of that, and then you hit them with ice spike, and that will finish most people off. I imagine someone will find some sort of combo, or that will be the combo that people tend to go for, which will result in a lot of one-shots. And the main way to prevent being one shot is to not have these five stacks of burn on you, which will inherently make it so that some perks like Invigorated are not like tier 4, tier 5 perks, but maybe are like tier 3, tier 4 perks, meaning that they're occasionally slot as a 1 or 2 of as like a 2.5 perk gear set in order just to counter this Firestaff. Firestaff being the main thing that people are going to shield versus. The other big thing that has kind of caused Firestaff to boom in popularity is the but potential bug with Shirking Fort. Shirking Fort at its current state, if you're in light and you have a 10% fortify on you and you're versus someone with invigorated punishment, that you're actually going to take more damage by putting that 10% fort on you, which basically means that stacking Shirking Fort is not viable entirely. Even versus melees, it effectively will only make you 5 to 10% more tanky. I believe in a full medium set if of Shirking Fort, it makes you about 7% more tanky, and that was a test that was done recently on Jesse's stream, so I could link to that. But basically, there's no reason to ever run Shirking Fort which will inherently kind of buff melees, but melees are also getting heavily nerfed. So there's a spot in the meta where melees can get a lot of value because people will not be running Shirking Fort, but they have to be able to be tanky enough to deal with firestaffs and whatnot. So where does that bring people, right? You can't run Shirking Fort. You have to run elemental version. You kind of have to run resil because firestaff scales off of int very heavily, and you want to not get one shot by a crit because it has 50 int bonus, and 50 int bonus will raise that crit damage modifier. Firestaffs tend to want to run vicious. They tend to run keen. So they're looking to play for those crits, so you have to basically go for as much aversion that you can get and as much resil as you can get, and then you're looking at weapon perks after that, right? From a perspective of how can we deal with this, the best way to prevent people from dealing damage when this kind of goes live will be sources of weaken. And sources of weaken are not something that has typically been sought after before, but there are a few things that provide really good sources of weaken. So enfeabling maelstrom is a really, really good source of weaken, but it's not a perk that let me look it up. Do I have to go to database? There we go. So now I got all my sources of enfeeble. So enfeabling maelstrom, when you're on great access is 25% weak and weaken, which this is basically your best bet in terms of like Shirking Fort. If you could hit a clump with this, this will be as valuable as Shirking Fort for everyone hit in that clump. So it kind of works the opposite, where you're trying to land debuffs on people so that they have the ability to deal less damage. So, and why did these debuffs stick? It's because that people are worried about firestaffs, or at least I'm assuming that they're going to be worried enough about some firestaff one-shot combo oriented build that comes out, because usually when these tens of things uh, are made, someone will find a way to make that weapon significantly overtuned and just kind of one-shot random people. So enfeeble will be a way to soft deal with that, and it will be basically the only way to deal with that sort of one-shot meta. But there's also like everyone has a little bit more con. Everyone's going to be running elemental aversion, so there'll be a balance there. But that still leaves a spot open for melees, as I alluded to earlier. But basically, a weaken is the only way to consistently prevent melee damage from actually going through, because Shirking Fort is so utterly useless. So enfeebling maelstrom basically becomes the best perk on Great Axe. The second best perk being thwarting strikes, or whatever the one is where you have grit and you deal extra damage. I'm pretty sure it's that. And then people will be running 300 con, I imagine. If you're not running 300 con, your next best perk is probably attunement. It will be interesting to see who does not run 300 con, but I imagine that you'll need the 300 con to be playing that weapon on point. There are other consequences too, like SNS is going to be heavily, heavily played. SNS did receive a indirect nerf from Void Gauntlet's aura getting nerfed, so it's not going to gen flat stam, meaning you can't just hold shield and be under the passive stam regen as a Void Gauntlet and never have to drop your shield ever again. You're actually going to have to drop your shield now in order to get that stam, but it's a kind of minor consequence because they'll have grit on their actual heavy attacks, which will be able to have, you'll be able to do stuff with that. But the other thing that this kind of opens the door up to is spear. So spear before was not like super popular. I've always said that it was like very close to being good, but never was quite good. The biggest change to spear is they got rid of the stagger that was on perforate, and instead they put a 10% weaken that lasts for 5 seconds, but could stack up to 3 times. So that's a 30% weaken. Basically, what perforate does now, this is a 30% fortify, 30% weaken, 30% rent. That fortify will not be very good unless you're in heavy. And medium, it will be acceptable. Like it will be like a effective 10% resistance boost. In heavy, I believe it will be higher than that, but that still needs to be tested. It's not the actual fortify is not of much consequence. It's mostly the enfeeble and the rend that you're putting on people. Rend also effectively gets nerfed by this fortify change, I believe, because it just works the opposite of uh, it works the Rend works the opposite of Shirking Fort now. So that fortify that you actually get in that Rend that you actually get won't matter as much, but you can stack those Rends higher. So there's no longer like a soft Rend cap at 30. This 30% Rend that you put from here on top of a Bruiser doing a Shockwave will add on top of each other, on top of a Void Gauntlet using Orb will also add on top of each other, meaning you can get to something like 60% Rend, which will be of more consequence later. which will also be another thing that forces cleanse spots. So now we have firestaff that's forcing cleanse spots. We have lots of runs that are forcing cleanse spots, and we're having potentially weakens that are forcing cleanse spots. So we're in a spot at this point where I look at the meta and I'm thinking disease is very, very good because it's like one of the only things that actually will lead to kills because that did not get nerfed. And that's one of those things where a 50% disease actually means you're going to get healed for 50% less. And life staff players have to be super, super scared because they can effectively just get one-shotted because of the changes to Shirking Fort, and they'll have to be specifically warded to whatever dex spec is or whatever range spec is meta that can one-shot them very easily. And there always tends to be some sort of spec that comes out that will be able to do that. And then if they're heavily warded to something else and they run something slightly off meta that's also still decent, then they'll just get one shot. So yeah, basically Spear has a 30% weakened and has a 44% weakened with Skewer if you actually get the enfeabling Skewer on weapon. And then your other perk that you usually have is something like Sweep, or you have Cyclone. Cyclone's an extra heal, extra stam. Sweep is a knockdown. So the difference between like a knockdown and a typical stun is knockdowns are not affected by freedom, which inherently will make them better in this upcoming meta. Even though more people will probably have the 300 con perk, they will not be affected by the actual getting up animation that uh or they will not be affected by like a stun duration. You won't be able to like kind of make that smaller. So the sweep knockdown will be like basically one of the most consistent and best forms of knockdown in the game. It's also noteworthy that it has a 10-second cooldown. And aggressive maneuvers reduces that to an 8-second cooldown. After you use that, you cycle your abilities, and this basically comes out to be like a 4 to 6 second cooldown for a knockdown that happens to last between 1 and 2 seconds. Again, this will not work versus grit, but it's very easy to land, and typically people are in predictable animations that are able to get this off. There are other knockdowns that will also be good, so Warhammer as Wrecking Ball will be a good source of knockdown, but again, Great Axe players are going to be somewhat forced to run 300 con or play 300 strength with stone form and just kind of play for that stone form, but most likely they'll be on 300 con, so they'll have a lot less burst. All their damage basically got nerfed as a whole across the board and got moved to more of a util class. So at this point, Spear has three very good abilities that have essentially no cooldown due to aggressive maneuvers. On top of this, you can very easily get to grit and you can cap with 300, and then you could also get to under 50 dex, which will just increase the amount of dodges that you have. And because Shirking Fort is so bad now, and the elemental version is somewhat necessary to be run, the best form of damage mitigation is dodging, because dodging will prevent all damage that's coming through, and you don't necessarily need that Shirking Fort to prevent that as long as you have enough stamina to dodge. And when you actually look at a spear tree that has some of the perks that I looked at, like this won't be an exact tree, but will be like closest to what you would probably consider running. You end up with a lot of perks that actually uh, extend like how much stamina that you have, and you're able to live a lot longer. I don't believe I can cut anymore on the right side, yeah. So there's a few on here. So the main reason why you go for Coop potentially is this counts as a heavy attack. You get Fortify off of that. You probably don't want this Fortify actually, so you probably go maneuvers. And at this point, you're just looking at stacking your dodges as much as possible. This is just a build that's just going to be spamming dodges all the time. And then you're looking at other things that will give you more stamina. So every time you crit, you get more stam. If you're attacking someone that's bleeding, that you're gonna get more stam. Coup de Grace has a bleed as a weapon perk that you can put on here. So that's another source of bleed. You got Skewer, which is a 15-second bleed. You have a lot of sources of keen that you can kind of get around. Exacerbating crits is really interesting because if you land a crit on someone that has like a rend or they have a weekend, it will extend that. So you could basically just target someone down on point and just make it so that they can't play the game because they'll have a 30% rend and a 30% weekend on them at all times. And while you're doing those light attacks and you're hitting those people, you'll be getting CDR. That CDR turns into stam. You kind of see the picture. You have a lot of stam generation. You have grit now, so you can't be kind of knocked out of that stam generation. That stam generation is also going to give you CDR. You're basically just it turns into a somewhat unkillable build relative to PTR, and PTR builds are generally a lot less tanky, but this is about the tankiest build that exists in PTR because it could mitigate a lot of damage. The other build that's really interesting, it can mitigate a lot of damage, is SNS, but Spear soft counters SNS because you could again apply a 30%, 30%, what do you call it? A 30% brand on someone, which albeit won't be as good, but tends to be better versus people that have more armor, which is a soft way to counter that. So spear is basically a build that can somewhat, or a weapon that can somewhat do it all when it comes to next patch in terms of survivability relative to other weapons. The main change that brought about this was the change to 300 con, because before when you tried to run spear, if you wanted to get to 200 if you wanted to get to 200 con before you were in a spot where and you wanted grit, then you would have to do 300 strength, 200 con, which was not possible, so there was no way to really get grit on spear. But now you can sacrifice some of that damage with 300 con, you can get to your 150 dex, so you have those dodges down, and then you could throw a little bit into strength to make those basic physical attacks do a little bit more damage. So that's like the high level overview of it. I kind of wrote that up as assumptions here, which I'll go through now. So basically, if in order for this to be true, Shirking Fort basically has to be useless. Based off a test that actually is useless, people take more damage with people that have an invig ring on if they apply Fortify to themselves. What this basically means is blunderbuss went from a weapon that was like S tier to borderline trash because Fortify is essentially a useless mechanic that does not count for anything unless you are heavy and maybe have a shield. Without the shield, it might still do something. It will be interesting to see if that Fortify stuff affects if you have like a shield on your back and you're heavy, or if you need the SNS out. But that's like the base idea there. We have to be in a meta where dots are commonplace, and there's a lot of things to force cleanse spots. I talked about some of those weakens, dots, plague, all that stuff is going to be doing a lot more damage than it used to. Those dots can turn into bursts, so you're generally going to want to prevent those dots, which inherently will mean a lot more ice gauntlets are being present than already are being played, which you honestly can't run that many more than are being played as current. But I imagine pile-ons will be very, very common as a secondary build for most classes. Medium Greatsword Warhammer is essentially useless except as a util role. So what this basically means is this is just going to be played in heavy. It's going to be played on point to fight in clumps, and there's no other spot for it to really typically be played. Even on point, I'm not sure if this has as much util as Spear does when the upcoming patch hits. The main util of this is the AoE stuns and your AoE weekend. Nothing from the Great Axe really has util just because of the insane nerfs that happen to Gravel, where it's basically useless as a damage weapon or a damage thing, but it can slightly clump people. I wouldn't say it clumps people super well, but it can kind of do it. Uh, but again, if you have that 300 con, you're not gonna, and you're in heavy now, you're not really gonna get that inherent value from rooting someone because everyone has so much natural root mitigation. So Great Axe is not in a great spot. Warhammer's in an okay spot with Wrecking Ball, but basically every other perk on the Warhammer is somewhat useless when it comes to next patch. Uh, Great Sword is still played, but more as an anti-elemental aversion kill squad role. What I mean by this is elemental aversion and physical and resil are basically going to become hard meta, or maybe physical aversion if firestaff got heavily nerfed. But there's no point of running anything upwards to melee in terms of like Shirking Fort because it effectively does nothing for 95% of players in a war. So that means that Greatsword will inherently get a value as a melee build, but more as like a kill squad build, and that kind of opens the gate for Spear because Great Axe Warhammer isn't very good. Uh, Greatsword isn't super strong, but is okay, and then you need another weapon that can kind of fill that role. When you actually look at the weapons and the options that you have, uh, Sword actually is pretty good, but is more of a single target weapon. Rapier, you're not going to see that as a main front dealing weapon for most people. It just does not make sense. Bow got nerfs and people seem to not like playing it, but that's not even a melee weapon. There are no other melee weapons besides hatchet and spear, and great axe that seem somewhat like they could do somewhat damage from a melee weapon perspective, and spear has a lot of things going for it that hatchet doesn't really have going for it with this defy death change, so you can't really go light super berserk, I'm gonna try to kill everyone hatchet as much. You're kind of either hard committing with this role or you're using it just to get out of as a get out of jail free card, which means it's being used as a secondary, not a primary weapon. And then Great Axe and Great Sword are not in fantastic spots because they both received pretty heavy nerfs. So Spear is basically the only thing that's left, which is why it is kind of the interesting thing. Freedom and Shirking Fort fall out because of these changes. Also 300 con. Basically, if people aren't running Great Axe Warhammer as much, there's no point of like slotting as much freedom, because if you're even freedom versus a spear doesn't do anything because a sweep is a knockdown, not a CC duration. so it won't actually change the duration of the sweep, which is kind of interesting. But freedom is not going to be effectively useful if Great Axe Warhammer is not being played a ton. So as a consequence of this, enfeabling is the only way to kind of prevent damage, is by throwing that on top of people. There's not many abilities or not many sources of enfeabling in the game. You got enfeabling skewer, you got poison shot, but you actually have to hit it direct with this, and it doesn't last for a significant amount of time. And maelstrom, so you're basically down to basically just spear and a great axe in terms of people that can use enfeabling. The other alternative is you run a hatchet and you run the disease, because that will apply a 10% weaken. So that's a way to kind of. So basically, you could run hatchet and we could apply that 10% weaken and disease, and that will be as much. If actually, it will be a little bit more protection than the actual shirking fort will do, which is kind of funny. And even if you have that 7% max shirking fort from running 5 of those, then invig is going to count versus 2% of that, right? So you only have like 5% less, or approximately 5% left, because the math gets a little bit weird there. But uh, enfeebling is just strictly better as in terms of a debuff perspective. So knowing that, knockdowns are going to become very popular. So sweep, wrecking ball are the main ones. Blast shot is okay. The main problem with blunderbuss is all these fortifies that make blunderbuss super strong and have made blunderbuss super strong are effectively useless unless you're in heavy. So if you're in heavy on point with blunderbuss, these will be useful, but they won't be as useful as they were before. But in terms of medium and light, they'll be okay. If that gets changed, I imagine some of these assumptions will change, but time will tell. And then enfeebling becomes very good. Blunderbuss is just basically a worse firestaff at that point, unless you're running heavy on point. But spear might outclass that, and Great Axe Warhammer might outclass that. But blunderbuss shouldn't be bad there because it's always historically like decent at that role. Great Axe Warhammer is not really slottable, except for except for the CCs and debuffs. So I've already talked about that. We're probably going from a spot where I'd say 15 to 20 Great Axe Warhammers are being run to a spot where I'd say 5 to 10 are going to be run, just because there's not much of a point to run that class anymore, except as an initiator. It's a good way to open up the door for other builds to come in and get value, but as a build as a whole, it's not going to be able to carry nearly as hard as it used to, and will likely just be slotted as a CC debuff kind of bot sort of role. So basically, as a consequence of all this stuff, the only thing that is left that seems decent in terms of a melee perspective is spear. Uh, Great sword is not bad, but only in a light kind of perspective due to the tracking changes. And even with those, the tracking changes inherently make it a little bit weaker. You're gonna have to juggle the CCs from the great sword with the actual great axe damage. And the reason why I say great sword is because you're gonna have to be able to close the distance versus some of these high burst people, which means you're either running hatchet or you're running a great axe with great sword. And most likely it's going to be great axe because the distance will be too big for hatchet and to actually close. So yeah, that's basically what I'm thinking in terms of why spear, on theory, on paper, seems like it's the best weapon in the game. And as a consequence of this, like the natural question, well, I'll talk about this first. You have cheap dodges, you got perforate, which is just the best ability in the game because it has fortify, weaken, and rend all in one, and it's at 30% for all those, which is about the highest I've seen from an ability in the game. You got two sources of weaken, and weaken is the best debuff in the game. You got a knockdown, which is again not a thing that's affected by freedom. You got insanely fast ults because you have so many bleeds. You can get a spear ult in about 10 to 30 seconds, which is fast. It's the only weapon that's faster than Ice Gauntlet. You have very good CDR because of the dodge mechanic that I talked about uh, with aggressive maneuvers. And then you can basically spam dodges to mitigate damage. Even without the Shirking Fort, this is very good. With the Shirking Fort, it was debatably a little bit better, but I think the other changes overall just make Spear a lot better than it used to be because it has grit, and you can get the dodges, and you no longer have to choose between those two. So the natural question is like, what do you want to pair with Spear if you're going to play Spear? Basically, anything seems like it can go at the moment. The two most obvious ones are Ice Gauntlet and Hatchet. The reason why that you do Ice Gauntlet is because Entomb is not affected. You don't. It doesn't matter if this is not going off event. Shower doesn't matter if you're not going off event. You probably want the Entomb because there are so many sources of things that you want to cleanse. So Entomb just makes a lot of sense. And then your last one, you're probably going to Ice Pile to try to get ults as fast as possible. Even though you're already getting ult faster does not really hurt. And if you're getting ult super fast, then you're considering going for something like Bile or Vines versus something more traditional like like a stone form. You could go stone form, and then you can go for perforate with stone form. I think that makes sense if you're on deady point. But if you're not on deady point, you're saying playing near the edge. I think it makes more sense to go for something like bile or vines and playing it as like an IGVG sort of role. But as a melee versus looking to do strictly damage, you could also look to do more strict damage and then go for hatchet, and then play it more as like a kill squad kind of soft harasser kind of role. I think that should work pretty well. You probably want some tree that looks like this. Again, infected throw is really interesting because of aerial transmission, but you could also do social distancing if you wanted to, and then kind of get uh, some stand back with that, and also have the offensive damage here. Also, hatchet scales off of both strength and dex, so this inherently just makes a lot of sense to pair with that weapon. Ice Gauntlet's more of a util role, will not increase the damage whatsoever, but did not get nerfed and still remains to be the best default passive weapon to choose. Some other things that are noteworthy: Warhammer, you could extend that duration of CCs and kind of go infinite with it. SNS, I've seen a decent amount in PTR. Uh, Heavy attacks have grit with SNS inherently, which makes it a better offensive role. Also, this has a 20% weaken on Shield Rush, which is probably the best source of weaken in the game because it's an AoE. So that's really interesting. And if you're not running SNSs, it makes sense to run this. Even if you are running SNS, like say you wanted to run SNS Spear on like medium, that would be like really interesting. It might be viable. Great Axe, I would say generally is a no go because both weapons are primaries, and you kind of want a secondary weapon. Uh, Warhammer, I think, can make sense, but then you have no escape. Void Gauntlet is possible to be run. I've seen it being run, but the problem is again, you don't really have much of an escape, so you have to play really, really passive with it. But it's possible to run it. And then Blunderbuss is interesting, but again, you want that 150 dex, which means that you're going to have 50 points in the Blunderbuss, which means that you're not going to do damage with this, which means it's a util roll. But the Fortify from the Blunderbuss as a util thing is not very useful anymore. So you're basically just playing for the Plague Splitting Grenades doing things, and for Apparatus to doing things, and Blast Shot to be doing things. So you're not playing for any of the damage stuff, which has been run before, but may be less effective than Blunderbuss or uh, Hatchet. The other one that's like kind of niche and weird might be bow is kind of interesting if you're playing for that ult chart super fast build. Poison shot is one of the best ways to get ult in the game because it's a big AoE lingering dot that applies to everyone. And then on top of that, you can kind of play this as a secondary with evade shot and something like rain of arrows or pen shot, or maybe you don't run the evade shot and you run just rain of arrows and pen shot and you play super passive like an IGBB. And then inherently you might be a little bit safer because you have the spear's weakens, and then you are still able to do good damage. This would be a build where you might not want to run that 300 con, you would probably want to run 150 con to 200 con, but you would still have the enfeables of the spear, which would prevent people from doing heavy damage to you, but you could also do good damage back to them. So it's like a weird spot there. But all this is basically off the assumption that you want as much enfeabling as possible, and Shirking 4 is no longer very good. And that is like off of 2 days of OPR meta, but firestaff seems to be the best weapon in OPR, and then spear seems to be fairly close to that, I would say. And nothing else is being super played except maybe for SNS and then like life staff, of course, but nothing else seems to be doing as much as those two weapons. And that's it for this one, guys. I'll see you guys in the next video.